Looks like we're live. I think I may have a little delay. Let's see. Welcome, beautiful humans, to Shift Sundays. I am your host, Lena Queen. We are here in my podcast, Erotic Lessons. And as you can see, I am a tad bit congested today because allergies be allergying. Thank you for joining me. Today, we are going to be talking about when it comes to erotic lessons. The way I've structured it is that we're going to talk about it in a couple of parts. And so Sundays, we're going to focus on shift, which is the embodiment, is the movement embodiment of moving from crisis, surviving, and thriving. We are going to stay focused on like the neuroplasticity of sexual healing and erotic healing. Let me make sure. Lessons. And as you can see, I am a tad bit congested today because I'm getting double feedback. Okay, so like I said, we're going to go ahead and talk about on Shift Sundays. How are we moving through crisis, surviving, and thriving, particularly right now when we are at the space of global chaos. And I do live here in the US on the East Coast. And so being able to understand how we are impacted by what is actually going on in this time, and how do we stay present and grounded enough? And when we can't stay present or grounded enough, how do we take care of ourselves? And so this is about being able to activate self-compassion. How do we activate self-permission to engage, to nurture ourselves without feeling shame or guilt? Capitalism has taught us that there is always something to do. Productivity is how we are taught that we have value, right? We are taught from the lesson of what do you want to be when you grow up versus who do you want to be when you grow up? And so Shift Sundays and Erotic Lessons is about reclaiming our humanity, reclaiming our connection to our wholeness, even though capitalism and colonialism would like to have us know differently. But we're just going to call that what it is, a damn lie. And we're going to move from that place where, and that's part of giving ourselves permission, we're going to move from that place of not accepting what people tell us our truth need to be, especially those of us of the global majority. And I do center the US Black experience, recognizing that the Black experience is global. And so African, Caribbean cousins, like, come on into the space because our collective voice matters, period. This is also a queer, sexuality and gender affirming space. So if you're queer and trans, whether you're a survivor or you are a professional who is a survivor, this space is for you as well. Because again, capitalism through the veil and the oppressive acts of like professionalism has us moving largely into spaces a lot of our time that cause us harm. And so when we think about how we are adapting, how ancestrally we and generationally we have adapted, and then what does that mean for us in real time when we're done adapting? This is what that conversation is about. It's about being able to create that safety and self-trust for ourselves, and how do we extend that to others so that way we can community build. We often hear community and collective together, but I think what we are missing is the synergy of what makes someone part of your community, what makes someone part of the collective that you're actually talking about. And if I've learned anything personally, and I, as a social worker, I use the professional use of self to bring in therapeutic lessons that could be helpful to the collective, and also to recognize that I'm in the space as a human being, a whole human being, a Black queer human being who just happens to also be 51 years old. And so also not being able to look through it through just a youth lens, but also an aging lens, a lens where as a baby elder, what does it actually look like to take care of ourselves? I am going to, so yeah, that's what today is about. So introduction to Shift Sundays. We're going to talk about how are we using decolonization as a care practice. And so that's what this is all. When we bring all this together about crisis, surviving, and thriving, being able to challenge the defaults that we have been taught, and that somehow we are othered because we do not center in what capitalism and colonialism deems respectable or desirable. And so part of my erotic intelligence workbook and sexual shadow work workbook, Healing the Erotic Self, actually covers that. One of the things I recognize as a clinical somatic sexologist and an integrated somatic sex therapist, and I've been a therapist for 23 years, is that oftentimes I was honestly conflicted, like I'm sure most of us were, when we are being taught something that we're like, but that ain't true. Or that truth, could be somebody else's truth, causes me and those that I love harm. And so when we are reclaiming our relationship to love, when we're like reclaiming our relationship to our understanding of life and really rejecting the racial caste system around the world, but particularly where we are in the United States, it really is about being able to understand how are we decolonizing as a practice, and that practice is really the embodiment practice that we're using to shift through crisis surviving and thriving, because we all deserve to thrive. I recently completed an article that was talking about the capacity of healthcare providers, regardless of where you are, from physician to administrative support, and how burnout is something that I feel like has gone by the wayside. They expect us to show up burnout, or if we're burned out, we have seen recently with the most recent executive order by this administration, how they are criminalizing mental health. And so it is all more important to really have tangible, actionable tools that you can use every day in your living to take care of yourself as you're moving through your ebbs and flows of your emotionality, your somatic experiencing, and really your understanding of yourself and your relationships. I created Shift several, I don't know, a long time ago, between 2008 and 2010. It was also because I was a survivor of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And part of my lived experience was I was an older student, finishing my bachelor's in social work, but also at the end of that abusive relationship. And so when I left that abusive relationship, simultaneously, I also met a mentor who introduced me to Egyptian yoga and meditation by Dr. Muatai Ashby. And so what I was seeing in real time was, what was it like to show up as a survivor, being a therapist? I was straight out of undergrad as a therapist. But I was an older undergrad, I was 27. And so like being a therapist, also being a single mom, really coming into understanding my queerness and how that actually shows up, which really I don't even tap into for another 13 years. But these things actually show up, and I think a lot of times my peer group between 34 and 54 years old, we have really been struggling with how we have been internalizing our lived experience, our professional education, and our intuitive knowing. And so that's what this conversation is inviting you to think about, is like, what is your intuitive knowing to self, and how you show up in taking care of yourself, knowing that you're navigating what I call the defaults, societal and sexual expectations and assumptions. In my workbook, I talk about, let me see, I want to say 12, but I believe actually 14 different messages that society has told us about our understanding of truth. I remember having this when I first started doing sexuality and gender training. It was really bad. And it was bad, not because I wasn't skilled, but because I realized that it was a different skill set and container. And so when I did the training, I was talking to folks who had no understanding about sexuality and gender, sexuality being all of who we are, not just sexual attraction. It is all of who we are, how we walk, how we talk, how we dress, how we pick our clothes, how we wear our hair. It is what informs our femininity, our masculinity, and the integration of those two things together, because they are not gender, but they do inform our gender expression and gender performance. And so I was really recognizing that even I can get to this simple ABCs of sexuality and gender, there were still a lot of messages that the folks that I was talking to was still operating from. And so what I realized from that point was that I don't do trainings anymore unless I'm doing it from a decolonial lens. Otherwise, it causes me harm. Otherwise, it causes potentially other folks harm who have not had services yet. And I am trying to mitigate that harm. I'm trying to make sure that doesn't happen. And so the person who had hired me to do the training was like, Queen, in the training, she was like, well, it's always been this way. And I was like, but it hasn't. And that does, and in the US, that doesn't make it right, specifically when we're talking about being able to come from a place of this is stolen land and enslaved labor. How are we informing the systems and the ways of being in which we've come to present day? Therapy, healing usually wants us to focus on the present without necessarily and ignoring the impact of the past. And so the liberation of the both and that the erotic gives us is to understand that we have to be able to look at things through an ancestral lens, a generational lens about what informs us present day. But at that time, being very new at this, I did not have that skill set to articulate. And so what you see today with Erotic Lessons, with the resources of the workbook, Healing the Erotic Self, that has been transformed into an entire liberation system of masterclasses, the workbook, erotic wellness, digital wellness plans, and an erotic affirmation journal. It became, how do we have a system? Because I was seeking things that was not yet created. And so my Virgo self was like, well, this is what I'm going to do, because this was also the work I was doing in one-on-one sessions with my clients. I was an outpatient. I am an outpatient owner of a mental health and sexual therapy practice, sexuality practice. And so it became, how can I take what I am doing in my therapy session, which really was my bubble, my protective bubble, because I knew in that space, it wasn't so much about my value self, but I knew in that space, it was about the space of co-creating, co-regulating with folks who respected and wanted to know more about, how do I return to myself, heal my broken heart, manage my ebbs and flow, my emotional ebbs and flows, without feeling like I'm not worthy of love, without feeling like I'm not worthy of happiness, without feeling like I'm broken. And so being able to take all of this information, plus the information that I learned through my educational period, which also included getting up to like chapter 2 of a dissertation report. And then Spirit was like, so you can't do this work in academia. Like, this is how far you go. And I was like, oh, okay. But that also too was an experience where I was like, how do we bring in spirituality? Because that was one of the reasons why I went back to school to be a sex therapist, was like, there needs to be a way to talk about sexuality and spirituality without necessarily centering Christianity, one of the assumed defaults. As someone who grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, someone who also attended Pentecostal church, someone who grew up in Black church, I knew that the church that I had experienced had limitations and had struggles with colonization, which we can continue to see today. But that doesn't mean that my relationship to the divine, that my relationship to my spirit is not important and not part of my healing. And so how do I bring that into healing spaces without religiosity, and really understanding the impact of religion and religious trauma? And so this is the work, and this is why we're here. Part of shift is being able to understand that what we're doing is taking care of ourselves, mind, body, spirit, and energy. Part of decolonizing somatics is Western colonial somatics, is understanding that it has always been about spirit. It's always been about our relationship to the divine. It has always been about honoring both the sexual part of ourselves and the spiritual part of ourselves. And so to me, that is the path of liberation. And so when I wanted to explore more of the how led me down the path of not just respectability, but desirability, because really what I want us to focus on, or want you to think about, is like, what's your relationship to self-worth? Do you realize that you have worth simply because you exist? This does not mean that if there's repair that you need to do for yourself, a relationship is not there, but we cannot take away our human right to worth, period. And so how does that show up in our relationships? How does that show up in our relationship with ourselves? And so shift is about being able to, what I call toil the soil before we plant seeds. How do we unlearn the messages of our past, both immediate and ancestral? And how do we create new narratives, healing narratives that are empowered by both our sexual self and our spiritual self? And that is what this space is about. If you are looking to learn more about this work, I invite you to take the Erotic Confidence test, the Erotic Confidence self-assessment, which is in, or it will be in the little description, because that will let you know where to start on your erotic journey with healing the erotic self, with one of my erotic wellness plans that you can do straight from home. And that is very good for coaching, therapy, self-care, professional development, whatever the case may be. But it's really good to be able to do that home study. And you wanted to start today. And so, yes. All right, so let's go ahead. And so that's why I started. Like, that's when you put all those pieces together, that's how I started. I'm also being very mindful that I know I am showing up very authentic. I am showing up very linear, while recognizing my neurospiciness will have me go down like story lanes. I'm like, wait a minute, I need to go back and reverse to that one. And so stay with me, because I absolutely know what I'm doing and what I'm talking about. One of my favorite authors that, again, thankfully for my my sexuality colleagues that I met in school, introduced me to Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, and I went to a HBCU, and through my social work at HBCU, I did not get that. I don't know if it was a reflection of where I was in that point in time in my life, and probably because I wasn't ready to receive it. And also, it could be that when you think about Black feminist thought, it is still considered fringe in Black culture. And so being able to look at Black feminist theorists, womanist theorists, has also been also informs this liberation work. And one of my favorites is Audre Lorde. Not only uses of the erotic, but the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And so for out of my workbook, Healing the Erotic Self, I mentioned Audre Lorde's powerful words and work, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, encourages us to remember that censoring societal and sexual expectations and systems will not liberate us. These defaults shame and marginalize individuals and communities that are not considered desirable nor respectable. Think about Patricia Hill Collins, The Matrix of Oppression. If you Google The Matrix of Oppression, you will see how the racial caste system, that's a really good visualization of how the racial caste system in the United States is, period. So in order to liberate ourselves, one thing we need to be able to do is to challenge those defaults when those become our motivation for seeking validation of self-worth. What are some of those defaults? Some of those defaults include heteronormativity, which is defined as the assumption that everybody around you is heterosexual. It is the expected expectation of everyone that you meet. And this is really clear when we think about how we interact with our children. The assumption is that they're going to get married. And when they're going to get married, it's probably going to be, you know, the other gender, right? Until they show interest, or they have interest, may not show or tell interest, of same gender. And then the one thing parents ask, well, how do they know? They're too young to know. And it's like the same way you knew that you liked your wife, right? Like, it's, but we other assumptions that are not part of the default. Another default, ableism. Ableism refers to the discrimination, prejudice, and exclusion of individuals with disabilities. This looks like assuming someone who doesn't have a visible disability does not have any disability. This looks like people who have chronic pain are faking. Black people who have chronic pain are faking. And so these become self-limiting beliefs and biases that we operate from if we don't really sit and unpack those things. And so to move from self-limiting beliefs to empowering beliefs, shift allows us to slow down, because capitalism is rushing, right? You're probably gonna be like, I'm gonna see her for 5 minutes and then I'm gonna go back and watch the rest. And then hopefully you will actually come back and watch the rest. But a lot of times, unless we're actually intentional about sitting down, not scrolling, and really paying attention from what place we're operating from what center we're operating from, and what's informing that center, we just continue to keep rushing. Completing tasks, going back to tasks to complete. How many tabs do you have open right now, right? And so being in that rush is really designed because our nervous system is responding to the pressures of us to always seek something outside of ourselves. And so how do you slow down the rush? It's something that I call the presence practice. So we hear in somatic experiencing, somatic healing, that we need to be present in the moment. And we know if we're coming from a place where we have experienced trauma, being present in the moment has been harmful to us. And we have learned trauma responses that take care of us because being present is too much for us, too much for our nervous system to be able to handle. And so our trauma responses become our default responses for how we engage sounds very technical, but how we interact in our relationships, how we receive love, how we receive pleasure, what we think about being sexual, right? And what we think about being desirable. And so knowing that trauma responses have probably become default responses, it is being able to create a presence practice. And so we take self-awareness and we move it with an intentional mindfulness that it is erotic mindfulness for the work that I do. And so you move from somatic mindfulness to erotic mindfulness, depending on the intention. And so the somatic mindfulness is erotic. But anyway, what is mindfulness? It really is about being able to attend to not only the whys, but also the hows. How are we going to get through? What is this telling us about our moment? And so we go intention, awareness, intention, and effort. And so those are the 3 steps in which I teach in order to get people to kind of slow down in a moment. And so if there's anything that comes out of our talk today, 1, it's getting to know us, getting to know me, getting to know this space. 2, recognizing that healing the erotic self is healing the whole self. 3, shift is an embodiment practice that allows you to move safely from crisis, surviving, and thriving. 4, the being present requires a presence practice in order to do so. 5, societal and sexual defaults Assumption and expectations, like the ones I've given earlier, are some of the messaging in which we are constantly unlearning and unpacking. And 6, decolonization as a care practice will liberate us. And so join me Wednesday as we move further into this conversation about decolonization as a care practice, about how do we create a desirable sense of self, and talk more about some of the sexy stuff. So I hope you intentionally take care of yourself. Remember, on this YouTube page, there is the sacred pause that you can use if you need to take a 5-minute break and you're like, where do I start? Start with the sacred pause. If you're looking to move more into erotic work for the sexual side, or you just need kind of a pick-me-up booster, then I would absolutely invite you to listen to the Erotic Breathwork Activation, which is a 21 breathwork meditation that allows you to energize yourself for whatever activity you want to do. And if you're looking to do this work at home, then I invite you to take the Erotic Confidence self-assessment, so that way you can find out which of the erotic care plans you can use at home from Erospirituality and myself. And so that's what I have for today. Thank you for joining me. If you have questions you would like for me to answer anonymously on here, then please send me an email at lovecoachmedia@gmail.com. Make sure you put in the subject question for Erotic Lessons, and I will go ahead and answer your question on one of my podcasts. So I'm here twice a week, Sundays and Wednesdays at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. I am Queen Erotic Spiritualist. I am a somatic sex therapist and the founder of Erospirituality and creator of Erotic Self. Until next time, take very good care of yourself, as I'm going to do the same thing because these allergies, good Lord. Till next time, peace and love.